The Iller Station slave market was a grim intersection of cruelty and commerce, orbiting the fringe of civilized space like a parasite. Built by mercantile cartels and sanctioned by corrupt factions within the Galactic Council, it was a place where ethics had long since rotted away. Species of all kinds were bartered here like commodities, war captives, debtors, or political undesirables. It was in this dismal place that Kalira found herself, shackled, dehydrated, and quietly awaiting the end of her usefulness. Kalira was a Zorenthi, once a member of a proud and enigmatic race known for their telepathic and empathic abilities. The Zorenthi had been scholars, diplomats, and visionaries until the Council turned on them during the purge of Sin Karen. Official history claimed they were too dangerous to be left unchecked. The truth was simpler: they were feared. Their minds could touch the minds of others, see beneath lies, and stir rebellion before it could be named. The war had been swift and brutal. Her people had been nearly annihilated. The survivors were scattered or enslaved. Kalira was one of the unlucky ones. Captured, stripped of her identity, and sold as a high-value exotic, she had cycled through several hands before ending up at Iller Station. Now, under artificial lights and cold metallic air, she stood on the auction. Block an unwanted relic of a dead civilization, she had once been beautiful by many species standards. Silver skin that shimmered like living metal. Eyes that glowed with soft violet luminescence. But now, her body was thin and bruised, her wrists raw from constant shackling. Her gaze, once proud, was distant, almost lifeless. No one had bid on her for over 6 cycles. She was labeled too old to be compliant, too fragile for labor, and too defiant for collectors. A risk, a waste. A ghost. Around her, the crowd jeered and barked out offers for other slaves hulking Gorax, docile Velari twins, even engineered biopets. The auctioneer, a bloated Torqueri with an artificial voice box, kept shouting numbers with rehearsed flair. Kalira ignored it. She had long since stopped hoping for rescue. She didn't dream of escape anymore. Hope, she had learned, was the most dangerous weapon her captors had used because it always led to disappointment. She expected the same routine. The crowd would thin. The auctioneer would sneer in frustration. She'd be dragged back to her cell, beaten for her unmarketability, and fed just enough to survive another cycle. But then, it happened. "I'll take her," came a voice not shouted, but spoken firmly. A voice that cut through the ambient noise like a blade through silk. Kalira blinked. So did the auctioneer. The crowd turned to locate the speaker, and there, striding calmly through the aisles, was a human. Humans were rare on Iller Station. Their territory lay distant from Council-controlled space. They were regarded with a mix of wariness and curiosity, an unpredictable species whose diplomatic behavior did not match their war history. But this one walked like he belonged. Tall, broad-shouldered, with graying stubble and a long coat lined with Terran patches, he exuded quiet authority. He wasn't here to make deals. He was here with purpose. The auctioneer scoffed, trying to recover. "Minimum bid is 40,000 credits. Certified funds only." The human didn't blink. "I'm not bidding," he said. "I'm taking her." "Ah." Hush fell over the room. Someone chuckled nervously. Another muttered, "Stupid ape doesn't know how this works." But then the human raised his hand. A golden flicker blinked on his wrist, his ident chip. And the market scanner lit up in confirmation. Class 1 Terran Diplomatic Clearance Council override. Accepted. The room froze. Only top-level diplomatic officers carried Class 1 authority, unquestionable clearance that overrode trade laws, station policies, and even council edicts. Whatever mission he was on, this man was backed by the Terran sovereignty. Interfering with him would be suicide. The auctioneer turned pale, then fell silent. Kalira stared at the human, stunned. He approached without a weapon drawn, without a demand made. Just quiet defiance in the face of a monstrous system. And with that, the chains around her ankles and wrists disengaged with a soft hiss. No words were spoken. He offered her a hand, not as an owner, but as a rescuer. 2 days to protest. She stepped off the platform, walked down the stairs, and followed him past the crowd. The journey from the slave market to the human ship was a blur for Kalira. She remembered walking through the filthy corridors of Iller Station, surrounded by silence, and the strange way people moved aside for the human Captain Holt, as if the shadows themselves didn't want to challenge him. But once they stepped into the ship's docking bay, everything changed. The air was cleaner. The lighting was dim, but warm. The cold, artificial cruelty of the station was gone, replaced with something grounded, real. The vessel was called the Nightward, and though Kalira knew little of human ship design, she could sense it was different. Not a massive warship, not a luxury transport, but something repurposed, armored, and deadly in a quiet way. Like its captain, she was taken directly to the medbay, a compact room lined with polished steel, diagnostic beds, and soft, low tones that calmed the nerves. It wasn't a holding cell. There were no guards watching her, no restraints keeping her in place. For the first time in years, her hands were free. An older human woman with graying hair and sharp, tired eyes performed a medical scan. She didn't speak to Kalira like a threat or like a tool to be catalogued. Instead, she hummed as she worked some old Terran melody Kalira didn't recognize but found oddly comforting. The woman Dr. Reyes, Kalira later learned softly, muttered observations, malnourished, fractured rib, malaligned vertebrae, some neurofeedback instability, likely from suppression collars. Her voice was clinical, but not unkind. Captain Holt watched silently from the doorway. He never loomed or stared. When the exam was done, he nodded once and left without a word, leaving Kalira to rest in the medbay. She didn't understand it. Where were the threats? The ownership contracts? The smug explanations of why she should be grateful to her new master? There were none. Over the next several days, the crew offered her food, fresh clothes, and access to a small cabin. It had a real bed, a window, and a locking door from the inside. That fact alone left Kalira shaken. She didn't know what to do with privacy anymore. She had to fight the instinct to sleep on the floor in the corner, curled like an animal. She said little. She observed everything. The crew of the Nightward was diverse, not in species, but in backgrounds. She saw a human engineer with cybernetic arms, a half-farn pilot who spoke 6 languages, and a quiet technician with old soldiers. Scars. They weren't slavers. They weren't mercenaries. They worked with precision, discipline, and something even rarer in this part of space, quiet camaraderie. Kalira kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the illusion to break, for Holt to finally explain what he wanted from her. Instead, he said nothing. She watched him during shipboard briefings, watching how he deferred to his crew, how he gave commands without arrogance. He wasn't running a business, he was leading a cause. But what kind? Eventually, Kalira approached him in the observation deck, standing beside the large transparent wall that overlooked a field of drifting stars. Her voice was rough from disuse, her words hesitant. Why did you take me from that auction? Holt didn't turn to look at her. He just stared at the stars. No one else was going to, he said simply. That's not a reason, she said flatly. He shrugged. It is for me. Kalira's voice grew harder. You risked a council violation. Class 1 clearance or not, you know what they do to people who interfere with slave routes. He turned his head then. His eyes weren't cold, but tired, old. I've seen what they do to people who don't interfere." She didn't know what to say. In all her cycles of captivity, no one had spoken like this. There was no angle, no power play, just a human who had chosen without reason she could yet understand to pull her from the abyss. Still, trust came slowly. She tested the limits. She asked for access to the ship systems and received them. She questioned crew members and got honest answers. No one expected her to clean, to cook, or to serve. No one called her pet, or asset, or slave. She was Kalira again, or simply Kale. In time, her health returned. Her posture straightened. Her psychic abilities, long suppressed by neural dampeners, began to flicker back to life, though she hid them carefully. Yet the question haunted her. Why? Weeks passed aboard the Nightward, and Kalira gradually moved from a stunned guest to a quiet observer. She still didn't fully understand her place aboard the human vessel, but the rhythm of the ship began to make sense. The crew operated with a strange efficiency, not mechanical, but deliberate, like each person had been trained for high-pressure missions. It was subtle, but unmistakable. They didn't behave like traders. No one talked about cargo manifests or profit margins. They discussed encrypted relays, planetary scan signatures, and cloak cycle timings. Conversations included terms like council corridors, soft targets, and exfil patterns. Kalira wasn't naive. These weren't smugglers. They were far more organized and far more dangerous. They were preparing for war or something close to it. One morning, Kalira ventured into the briefing room. She lingered at the back as the crew reviewed a transmission intercepted from a slaver coalition operating in the Argus Rift. The footage showed Xeranthi children chained in stasis crates, labeled as volatile stock. She froze. Captain Holt, standing at the front of the room, didn't pause in his analysis. He calmly explained troop rotations, weak points in orbital security, and the likely resistance response time. The rest of the crew absorbed it like second nature. There were no shouts, no chest beating. Just quiet, simmering resolve. Kalira's hands clenched into fists. These weren't just freedom fighters. They were professionals. After the meeting, she confronted Holt directly in the mess hall, where he sat alone reviewing a galaxy map on a portable holoprojector. "You knew," she accused. "You knew they were taking Xeranthi." "I did," he replied, not looking up. "And you didn't tell me?" He finally looked at her. Not with guilt, not with superiority, but with measured calm. "I don't give orders to people who haven't chosen to." "Stand," he said. "This is your war, or it's not." His words shook her more than 1,000 speeches could. Holt didn't need her. He wasn't trying to use her. He was giving her something no one had in years: agency. Kalira didn't respond right away. She left the room, walked to the observation deck, and stared out at the stars. She thought of her people, the massacres, the surrender, the silence afterward, and then of the children in those stasis crates. She realized something then. The galaxy had stopped seeing her as a person the moment her people fell. But Holt hadn't. He didn't need her power. He hadn't asked for her psychic abilities. He had taken her from the auction block without knowing if she'd ever recover. That choice wasn't strategy. It was principle. Later that cycle, Kalira requested access to the Nightward's intelligence archives. Holt approved it without question. She pored over mission logs, black market intercepts, and footage recovered from raids. Bit by bit, a pattern emerged. The Nightward was part of an unofficial Terran shadow program, Operation Ghost Lantern, a coalition of rogue captains, retired operatives, and sanctioned deniable assets. Their mission: dismantle the galactic slave trade from the inside out. No bureaucracy, no treaties. Just results that the Terran sovereignty knew what was happening out in the frontier systems. The Council had either turned a blind eye or actively benefited from the trafficking. And Earth, unwilling to start a war, had sent ghosts instead of armies. The Nightward was one of those ghosts. Kalira sat in the dark that night, haunted not by fear, but by purpose. She had power. Power the slavers feared. Power that had once made her people a target. For so long she had buried it, afraid of being hunted, exploited, dissected. But now she saw something else. That power could be used, not as a weapon of destruction, but of liberation. She went to Holt's quarters the next morning. He opened the door before she even knocked, as if he already knew. 6 months after stepping aboard the Nightward as a broken and discarded slave, Kalira volunteered for her first mission. She was no longer the quiet observer or the haunted survivor lingering in the background. She had trained with Holtz. Crew endurance drills, ship combat simulations, mental discipline exercises. And more importantly, she had begun to reclaim her psychic abilities, not for war, not for vengeance, but for purpose. The target was a slaver hub on Rulvik 4. A volatile backwater world under the protection of several corrupt council factions. The surface was a tangled mess of industrial pollution and decaying infrastructure. But underground, a hidden auction house operated in the shadows, one of the most active in the Verge, and rarely hit due to its camouflage protocols and rotating vendors. But this time, they had something that changed everything. Xeranthi children. Dozens of them. Not just prisoners, but infants and younglings. Survivors of camps and experiments. Taken from the shattered ruins of her homeworld, bundled into stasis crates, and sold as rare cognitive specimens. Kalira's hands shook when she first saw the intercepted footage. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She just stood, pale and quiet, until Holt entered the room. "I'm going," she said flatly. Holt met her gaze. "It won't be clean." No, we're not there to make statements." "I know," she repeated. He gave her a nod. "Then suit up." The plan was precise. Kalira would infiltrate the auction house disguised as an independent broker's proxy. Her Xeranthi appearance would give her an air of legitimacy among those used to trafficking in the rare and the obscene. Holt and the rest of the crew would wait in orbit, cloaked, ready to strike when the alarm was triggered. Kalira was the match. Nightward was the fire. She descended alone in a small shuttle, wearing ceremonial robes fitted with micro-armor underneath. Her psychic signature was masked using neural dampeners to avoid suspicion, but not completely. Just enough to convince the auction house that she was a soft telepath, valuable, but not dangerous. The interior of the auction house was worse than she imagined. Dim corridors with flickering lights, walls lined with cages, mechanical arms dragging limp bodies into crates. A twisted parody of order. The auction itself was conducted in a large subterranean hall, shielded from scans and transmissions. Dozens of buyers from across the sector gathered, cloaked in wealth and indifference. Some were nobles. Others, cartel bosses or military defectors. All of them monsters in gilded clothing. Kalira moved among them like a ghost, pretending to be one of their own. She stood in the front row as the first crate was opened. Inside, a Xeranthi child, no older than 3 cycles, blinked in confused fear. The auctioneer, a bloated Orvax, boasted about cognitive potential and brainstem pliability. Laughter echoed through the chamber. Kalira saw red. She tapped her comm discreetly, sending the activation signal. Then she removed her DMPENER. In an instant, her psychic presence surged across the chamber like a thunderclap. Minds froze mid-thought. A wave of emotional paralysis swept over the crowd. Terror, guilt, shame, regret, all the feelings they had, Long buried, she ripped them to the surface. One by one, slavers collapsed, gasping, weeping, screaming. Then the ceiling exploded. The Nightward dropped into the atmosphere like a falling star. Its strike team blasted through the auction house's upper levels, disabling shields, neutralizing turrets, and executing a flawless breach in under 90 seconds. Kalira stood perfectly still in the center of the auction floor as Holt and his crew stormed in. The slavers were already broken physically and mentally. All that was left was cleanup. 32 children were rescued that day. The station's databanks were copied, names and trade routes exposed to allied anti-slavery networks. The facility was demolished from orbit by precision micro-munitions, leaving no trace. When Kalira returned to the Nightward, she didn't speak for a long time. She sat in her cabin, staring at her own hands, wondering who she had become. Holt visited her quietly. He didn't say much, just sat beside her. After a while, she asked, "Did I do the right thing?" Holt replied, "You stopped monsters and freed children who'd never have had a chance. That doesn't feel like enough. It never does." Later, she stood on the Nightward's bridge, looking out at the stars. Somewhere in the galaxy, other children still waited in darkness. Others still suffered behind auction doors and corporate contracts, but now they had hope. Kalira had been pulled off an auction block, abandoned, unwanted, considered too broken to be of value. But by the time the galaxy heard her name again, she was no longer a forgotten slave. She had become a legend. The Nightward's campaign did not stop with Rulvik 4. Over the months and years that followed, the Terran vessel carved a path through the outer reaches of Council-controlled space, disrupting slaver syndicates, dismantling auctions, and quietly liberating thousands. Their methods were quiet but devastatingly effective. Where they struck, the local trade routes collapsed, black market exchanges fell silent, and the syndicate leaders either vanished or were found floating in the void. Kalira wasn't just along for the ride anymore. She had become the soul of the mission. Her role extended beyond combat. Her psychic abilities, once dulled and buried, had matured into something more refined, more potent. She could do more than disrupt or paralyze. She could detect fear, manipulate enemy coordination, and cloak the Nightward from passive mental scans. She became both blade and shield for the crew, and every mission she participated in pushed her further from who she had once been, and closer to something new. But the real shift happened outside the ship. Whispers began spreading among the fringes of the galactic underworld. Stories of a silver-skinned specter that walked among slavers like death itself. A Xeranthi, thought extinct, now wielding vengeance with terrifying precision. Some claimed she could rip thoughts from your head without touching you. Others said she turned your guilt into physical pain. A few believed she was a ghost already dead, kept alive by fury. Of course, most of these tales were exaggerated. Kalira was no specter. She still doubted herself, still battled the nightmares of captivity, still woke at times in a sweat with memories of cold chains. But if those stories kept the auction block silent, she let them spread. The legend served the mission. Back on Earth, few even knew of Operation Ghost Lantern. The Terran sovereignty preferred it that way. Quiet heroes didn't earn medals. They earned scars. Holt and his crew didn't operate for recognition or diplomacy. They were the knife in the dark, cutting out rot where open war would be politically disastrous. And among that crew, Kalira had become the most feared edge of that blade. Her transformation didn't erase her pain. There were moments, especially after missions, when she'd sit in her cabin, surrounded by the silence, and feel the weight of it all pressing down. The faces of the children, the begging slavers, the knowledge that for every hub they destroyed, another might take its place. Holt never judged her for those moments. He understood the burden. One evening, after a particularly difficult mission on a gas mining colony where they uncovered a bioengineering lab using enslaved Valari children. As test subjects, she approached him. "Does this end?" she asked. "Ever?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Probably not." "Then why do we keep going?" "Because we're not trying to save the galaxy," he replied. "We're trying to save someone one person at a time. And that's enough." Those words stayed with her. Kalira wasn't trying to undo all the wrongs of the universe. She couldn't resurrect her people. She couldn't burn the council to ash, tempting as that was. But she could choose. She could keep choosing every cycle to stand where others turned away, to step forward when no one else would. And that, she realized, was the most human thing of all. By the end of her second year aboard the Nightward, Kalira stood on the bridge beside Holt, no longer as a rescued prisoner, but as a co-leader. The children they'd saved had been given safe passage to Terran worlds, hidden colonies, and independent protectorates. Many would never know who had freed them. They didn't need to. The mission was never about glory. In the deepest shadows of the galaxy, where monsters whispered and innocence was currency, a single ship had become a myth. A vessel that struck without warning, a crew that never asked for thanks, and a woman with silver skin and eyes that glowed like justice itself, had once been thrown away by a broken galaxy, and now stood as its reckoning. They had called her worthless,